Welcome everyone to An Hour with Dr. Stewart. Once again, the show that searches to understand the nature and the dimensions of relationships. Or in other words, how and why in different situations we'll relate to different people differently. Perhaps the context too will imbue that way we relate to the person. So that's an intriguing question that I've always pursued, and it's something that I'll be pursuing the rest of my life and questioning forever. Tonight, it is a privilege, an honor, and a pleasure to have with us Dr. Lawrence E. Hedges. Dr. Hedges is a psychologist and a psychoanalyst. He is a noted author, speaker, teacher, and supervisor, as well as a colleague and a very good friend. This is a man that has taught me how to listen to people more than anyone. Among other things tonight, we'll be speaking about how people relate, how they sustain relationships, but also, and perhaps paradoxically, how people do not relate. A very interesting way of looking at things. So we'll be on the cutting edge of seeing how relationships are sustained and how they're disconnected. So stay tuned, let your mind, your body, and your spirit be stimulated, as we'll be right back after this brief break with Dr. Hedges.
Don't you love that safe, free feeling you get in a pickup truck, Larry?
Yeah, nothing but you, me, the open road, a deer.
Yeah! A cow! Yeah! An ostrich! The village people! The village people?
You could learn a lot from a dummy. Buckle your safety belt.
Especially in pickup trucks.
I didn't know the village people were doing a road tour.
It's only a little motor oil.
What difference is one drop of paint gonna make?
This much fertilizer isn't gonna pollute anything.
You're looking at a sea of excuses, created drop by people like you and me. Our waters can be saved if each of us does their part. Drop by drop. If we all do a little, we can do a lot. Brought to you by the Natural Resources Defense Council, the EPA, and the Ad Councils of the US and Japan.
Crazy on a ship of fools. Crazy on a ship of fools.
Welcome back to An Hour with Dr. Stewart. And here we are with our guest, Dr. Larry Hedges. Larry, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Sean.
Oh,
Glad to be here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. Let me begin. I ask all my guests this first question. What got you into this field of psychology, psychoanalysis? Tell us a bit about that first.
Well, Sean, I think I'd certainly like to say that it wasn't because I had so many problems I needed to solve them, and that's what led me into the field, but I suppose that's why most of us are there.
Certainly what got me there.
That's certainly it. I think an interest in studying relationships, mine with others, and the ways in which we all avoid relating. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that was a very important part of it.
Where did you first begin your school training?
I guess maybe to answer the first question a little more fully
was
I was up in Connecticut a couple of years after college teaching in a college prep school, and it was there that I began to get very interested in. I had a whole school full of little Holden Caulfields that were back and forth between Boston and New York on the weekends, with a whole set of very interesting issues that were coming up for them, and they would show up in the dorm master's apartment to kind of go over what had happened on the weekend and how this parent wasn't treating them right and what went on with this girlfriend and the trouble they were in now. Mm-hmm. And so at that point I began taking night classes at Southern Connecticut College, and then went to University of Iowa for my doctorate, and then I went back to Connecticut to the Institute of Living for my internship a couple of years later.
What did you get your doctorate in?
In clinical psychology.
Okay.
And then following the doctorate, I came to California, where I studied postdoctoral work for 4 years at the Rice Davis Child Studies Center in Los Angeles. And that's where I really got my psychoanalytic training.
And what were you doing there? Tell us about what is psychoanalytic training?
It was, for me, it was a really an eye-opener, because during the 2 years full-time and 2 years half-time that I was at Rice Davis, sponsored really by the National Institute of Mental Health. During the time that I was there, I really got acquainted with 5 children. So it was 4 years getting acquainted with 5 children. And I saw them from 3 to 4 times a week, each one of them. And these were children who had encountered various difficulties in the course of growing up. And so it was an opportunity for me to experience really close hand, very intimately, these children, and to then at that point begin to discover all the webs of networks of relationships that these children were involved in their home, their family, their churches, their communities. And as a result of that, to feel totally immersed in that web of relationships that they had. And it was a very fortunate experience for me to have that.
Now, right there, there's a good point. Kids aren't like adults, as we all know. Kids aren't going to come in and say, well, here's how I feel today, and here's my problem. How would you work in that period with the kids in the consulting room? Well,
it's very interesting because the kids that I worked with were from 07 to 14 or 15. And surprisingly enough, they knew exactly.
Oh, so they were more verbal about it?
Well, not necessarily verbal, but children have an uncanny sense of something not quite being right. And so while they may at times go willingly to see the shrink, or at other times they may go kicking and screaming, by the time they get in the room and figure that this is not such a bad guy, they begin in whatever way they have, in whatever age-appropriate way there is, of telling me about themselves.
But not necessarily verbally. You're going to have to see a lot of that acted out through the play.
No, I saw a boy for a first session last week, an 11-year-old, and right away he began to tell me about his computer, and before too long he wanted to know about my computer. And then we were out in the office looking at the computer that was there, and he was wanting to get behind it and pull the plugs in and out and show me this and show me that and show me something else. And in the course of it, I learned a lot about him. I don't know what his parents thought about him teaching me computer, but I learned a lot about the boy.
Because oftentimes the parents are going to say, well, what did you do with Dr. Hedges today? And, well, we played with the computer all day.
Well, I try to warn parents that those stories will come home. The computer is a new twist on the whole game, but I used to warn parents that you'll be shocked that children are coming home because they'll tell you all we did was to play Monopoly, or all we did was do this. And with adolescents, I warn parents, that I'm sure you'll be told that all we talk about is drugs, sex, and rock and roll. And the parents look a little bit surprised, and I said, and that will be true. That's what we talk about. And then the parents get it.
Now, give us an example, perhaps, of how you'll extrapolate what's going on deeply within the child from hearing them talk about drugs, sex, and rock and roll, or playing Monopoly.
I'm not sure that I can always know for myself exactly what they're telling me. It's like any other problem in communication. But by being there week after week, sort of inquiring and listening, they end up continuing to tell me about how their life is at. So before too long, if we're playing a game of cards or something, soon the child begins to show me how to cheat. And before too long, I began to realize that he's got several different ways of cheating, and I began calling him, and he begins to tell me to shut up. And before too long, I start to cheat. And of course, then I'm probably not going to be allowed to cheat. And so then I begin to realize, okay, what you're telling me is something about what goes on at home, that the rules are made by other people.
Right.
And they can bend them and they can cheat them, and you can't. You have to play by the rules. Shut up and play. So,
a very good example of what's being played out in your office, being played out at home as well.
Exactly.
So now, from this period, you went where now? After this training?
After I completed my training at Rice Davis, I went to Newport Beach, and so in Newport I dealt with a lot of adults as well as children and teenagers.
What year are we in?
That was in 1970.
Okay, so we're not up to 83 yet.
No.
You wrote your first book.
That was the first book. The first book was published while I was still in Newport Beach. That was 83. And then I moved my office to Orange in 85, and I've been in Orange ever since.
And your first book was Listening Perspectives.
Listening Perspectives.
Tell us about that, and especially what generated the idea to get a book out there.
That's an interesting question, Sean, because I never set out to write a book. I set out to organize my thoughts. That is, I had been trained at Rice Davis with a group of supervisors who had gone to London, to Hampstead, and studied with Anna Freud. And
now for the viewing audience, Anna Freud is Freud's daughter.
The daughter of Sigmund
Freud, right.
Right. So the story that was often circulated about Miss Freud was at graduation from Hampstead, the Child Study Center, where people came from all around the world to study child psychoanalysis. At graduation, Miss Freud would typically be asked to speak, to send the graduates off to Australia and South America and back home after they'd been in London for an intense experience. And Miss Freud was reputed regularly to have said, "You've come to London, to the center of child psychoanalysis, and you've now listened to children for 4, 6, 7 years, however long, and you must go back to the place that you came from and just shut yourself in your consulting room for a good 5 years and don't listen to anybody, don't publish anything, don't write anything. Just listen to the children that come there, because they will teach you what you need to know." And so with that piece of advice handed on to me, I went to Newport Beach and I began listening to the children, and adults began coming as well. And of course, there's very little difference between children and adults, except the children are usually more honest. And so, as we got
that
to,
they are. My daughter's sitting in the audience, and she's very honest.
She's very honest. We've
Yes.
heard a few things from her tonight, and Shauna is very honest. And your other 2 girls are too. And children will say things that are very true that adults are afraid to say. So actually, in some ways, it's much easier working with children because, like the examples I was giving you, if
Sure.
they need you to shut up, they'll tell you to shut up. And so often adult patients think that I'm some sort of a hallowed doctor that knows what I'm saying, and so they're quiet and listen until I finally invite them to tell me to shut up when I'm saying too much.
So it's obviously a substantial part of your training has been with kids.
Of the training?
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
exactly.
And then bringing adults in and
Yes.
mixing it up a bit.
Exactly.
And so and this is a very good point, because we learn the most from our patients,
Absolutely.
is what you're saying.
Exactly.
I mean, we need to go to school, we need to read, we need to do these things, but really, and I've experienced the same thing in my own practice. I mean, I learned a tremendous amount from you, but I've learned the most from listening to the people who come into the consulting room, telling me about their world.
It's finally our clients that tell us how we need to be in psychotherapy. That there are wonderful ideas in the books that we read. We've got a 100-year-old tradition of ideas about the listening situation that are very valuable for us to learn, but that just helps us sort of stay in the room and be quiet when we need to be quiet. But it's finally the people who come to our consulting room who teach us what we need to know.
So you didn't set out to write your first book, Listening Perspectives.
No, I didn't.
It was, how did it get published? How did it turn into a book?
Well,
as you're not setting out to write it. You know, usually we set out to do something.
I know, I didn't. Borrowing from Miss Freud's
Sure.
suggestion, I needed to just listen. I listened, and I didn't read a lot of theory for that 5, 7, 8 years, whatever. And then at some point, a lot of new literature in the 70s began appearing. There was an explosion of psychoanalytic literature with the work of Heinz Kohut, Otto Kernberg, Margaret Mahler, and Edith Jacobson had done some very important pieces. So at that point in time, I began reading a whole set of breathtakingly new ideas about who we are as human beings and how we can begin to listen to one another. And so I needed to sort those ideas out for myself. And so I set about writing really writing a lecture. I intended to give a lecture for the California Graduate Institute in Westwood. And I had a 3-hour evening designated. And I gave myself about 6 months. And I was going to write a lecture on the kind of cutting edge of thought at that point in time. We were moving up towards 1980. That lecture was in April of 80. So I read and read and wrote, and I began to realize that there was a brave new world that was very different from the world that I had learned from, that had been passed from Sigmund Freud to Anna Freud and to me. There was a whole new set of ideas about much earlier development than Freud and Anna Freud had had a chance to study. So at that point, I began to want to organize my thoughts and organize the literature, and I used setting up the lecture to do that. I'd already learned by teaching classes at a number of different schools, California Professional School, California Graduate Institute, Cal State LA, Cal State Long Beach. I taught at all those places. And I began to discover that teaching helped me know what I thought. That is, by going into a classroom and facing 10, 20, 30 inquiring minds, I've got to put out something of what I know. And you don't really know until you begin to say what you think you know. And so at that point, I decided to set up a lecture on the cutting edge. And then I got cold feet towards the last minute, because this is a pretty outrageous lecture. This is kind of going off the deep end. These people that I'm reading now are saying things that haven't been said before, and I'm a little worried. I don't know what I'm talking about.
Now, the cutting edge is, and maybe say more about this for the viewing audience. You're coming from a world where people are dealing with more well-developed people, and you're going now, the cutting edge is treating lower developed people. Can you say?
We can say it that way, or what we can say is that the history of psychoanalysis and all the therapies that have spun off and taken different directions from that, the history is when Freud first started, we were studying the so-called neurotic pictures,
sure,
which develop at 4, 5, and 6 years of age. And the reason that we did that was plainly that Freud, when he was in doing his own self-analysis, he had issues along about those age periods that he needed to study. And so he gave us the first way to begin mirroring back to ourselves the patterns of emotional relatedness that we learned, say, around 5 years old. And so that the first 30, 40, 50 years of psychoanalysis was spent studying so-called neurosis. But
which really is also a developmental level. It's a period in time of development. I think Freud gets misinterpreted a lot in that he's used ubiquitously developmentally when actually he was speaking to a period. Am I correct here?
Predominantly. Well, you know, the problem with all scientists, and Freud was certainly a scientist, is that you get an idea and you generalize it to places where it probably shouldn't be generalized.
Sure.
So Freud and all of the early analysts did overgeneralize their ideas to places where they probably shouldn't have. But hindsight tells us that they were developing a way of listening to people who had fundamentally sound development. And by fundamentally sound development, that is that there were not major intrusions into their life. They had relationships that more or less worked up through the 5 and 6 year old period. And so then at that period, they then solidified a set of relationships. We call them neurotic, and the only reason we call them neurotic is we carry those relationships on through the rest of our life, and yet in the rest of our life, our relationships are not necessarily the same as they were at age 5.
So is that a definition of neurotic?
It's basically a definition of neurotic. That is that the patterns that we learned in our primary family of how to relate, who gets away with whom, who loves whom, what can I do when, if you and I are here and you know, you're my father and your wife here is my mother, okay? There's a triangle here, and I, as a young child, learned to relate in that triangle. So Eleanor and I have a very special relationship as a child, and the minute Sean enters, that relationship with Eleanor and I change. And it's younger children know it changes, but they don't know quite how to study it and how to work it. But by 4, 5, and 6, children know full well how to work the relationships in their family.
They understand the dynamics.
Yes, and the other way around is when I'm with my father, and I have one relationship that's just the two of us, and then Eleanor, my mother, enters.
Mom walks in the room.
Mom walks in the room, things change. Or if I have a brother and a sister or whatever. So all third parties change the relationship, and that was really Freud's genius to see that the place at which our mind takes off and becomes fully symbolic, the place in which our bodies are fully enmeshed in the symbolism of human language and culture, is around age 5 or 6. It's a critical nexus in our development, and that we certainly develop for the rest of our lives, but that some of our initial assumptions solidify at that point. And we call them neurosis. Maybe
or the Oedipal period.
Or the Oedipal period. And those may not be the best terms, but they're pieces of history at this point in time, really to describe the family relationships that a child learns about and learns how to manage at that particular period in time. So by the time the 70s came along, we began to move down with Heinz Kohut to the 3-year-old period, and then when we moved to Margaret Mahler and Otto Kernberg and another whole group of people, we moved down to the 2-year-old period.
Well, why don't we talk a bit about the 3-year-old period?
All right.
We've developed the 4 or 5 neurotic Oedipal period that Freud gave us,
right,
historically, and now structure for us the 3-year-old period.
Well, the 3-year-old period has been written by many, but the person who's given us the most, I believe, is Heinz Kohut,
yes.
Originally a Viennese analyst who came to Chicago. And I had the pleasure of being in Kohut's presence on a number of occasions, and actually was there for his last talk 3 days before he died. He focused on the 3-year-old period as the period of the development and the solidification of the sense of self. That is, when we talk about the Freud period of the 5- and 6-year-old period, the child has a very strong sense of self and is studying interactions among a group of selves.
Right.
But at the 3-year-old period, the child is at see me, see me, see me, see how strong I am, see what I do, see how high I can jump.
Look at my big mud pie I just made.
Exactly. What a pretty dress I have on, you know, how hard I can beat on my drum, whatever it is. So, and the proper parental response, as we know from those of us that have children, is, wow, you know, you're fabulous. You're really doing great. I'm very impressed. Do it again.
Look at the drawing I did on the wall.
Exactly.
You know, wow.
Yes,
try to be nice there.
Yes, and Coe was fond of giving examples like that, like the wrong response is, put those crayons away right now.
But that's a horrible drawing. How could you?
We need to first acknowledge the skill that the child was trying to
So we're
portray.
acknowledging the child's sense of self and wonderment that that he or she is discovering within.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. And so Coe worked then on that, and when he was forming a theory of therapy for people who have who are working on relationships issues from the 3-year-old period, he had a certain idea about the nature of that interaction between a child and whoever else is in the environment. He happened to call those others self-objects, meaning they are mother and father and whoever else is there, and they're used as love objects, but they're known to be separate, and they're known to be people that are loved, but the child, for the purpose of firming up the sense of self, uses the love objects to make me feel better about myself. Right. Yes, exactly.
So an example of a child using mom or dad to make her or him feel better about
feel
himself.
Strong and to know who I am as a person, and to feel strong about my developing skills, about my capacities, and about how well I do things.
Now a person, an adult who would be in this phase, you know, I struggle for words here. We use fixated, arrested. What's the way how do you like to say it?
Well, those are all useful words.
Sure.
I tend, since whenever I begin to think about the way human beings are, I always start off really from the place that I know best, which is the consulting room, or a room in which two people come in and close the door and say, we're going to just be here and get to know one another. So the listening situation that for more than 100 years has characterized psychotherapy is really nothing more than an ideal situation for two people to relate. We close the door, we don't let anybody in, we don't talk about what's going on here with anybody else, we just try to find each other and find out what that's about. And that's really all the psychotherapy situation is, but we rarely have that special opportunity to have 45 minutes with somebody else just focused on each other. And that's really what gives psychotherapy its power. It's unfortunate that we don't spend more time like that with our children. A friend of mine who's a psychologist, his daughter, who was about 7 at the time, finally figured out what it was he did. And he also saw children. So she knew that the toys in his office were for other kids that came in, and she figured it all out. And she says, Daddy, I want to come for a session with you. So he thought about it a minute and says, okay. So she arranges with her mother, and they set up sessions. And so once a week, she set up sessions in which she was going to come in at exactly 4 o'clock, and she was going to stay till exactly 4:45, and she was going to have her daddy all to herself. And she loved it. She just loved it. And it's unfortunate that most of our children don't quite have that right amount of time. And it's in that kind of situation that we listen. So going back to your question, Coe felt, well, Freud felt that we rarely listen to ourselves or have anybody listen to us about our relationships. And so he set up the psychoanalytic situation to listen to people about their relationships and about how they carry on forward out of the past their emotional patterns into relationships in the present. So I'll introduce the word that's going to be key tonight, transference. Okay. So Freud's notion of transference was that we all develop patterns of relating, emotional patterns of relating, early in childhood, and that we carry those patterns into later relationships. So that when I come to you as Sean, who is my friend and colleague, I may suddenly be aware that you're relating to me in a certain way, and some emotional pattern from the past may suddenly be projected onto you. So I see you with father glasses, as though you're not Sean, but the way you're looking at me reminds me of the way my father used to grill me with demanding questions.
Sure.
Okay? And we all do this.
Sure.
So we all transfer into our current relationships emotional patterns from the past, and we know that we do it so well that, I mean, it's become laughable in our human relationships or significant relationships, marriages, to be able to look at your spouse or your partner and say, I'm not your mother, so don't talk to me that way.
So instead of looking for where we're looking for to see how the person's relating to us, and then juxtaposing it to the developmental ideas we have.
Exactly.
Okay.
So actually then in the play that children do with me, I'm trying to pay attention to how they relate to me and the ways in which they're afraid to approach me, like the little boy I told you who was into computers. Now, I noticed that he was afraid to touch my computer at first. And so then I noticed that he was afraid to ask me if he could, he saw that I had a new mouse, kind of a state-of-the-art mouse, and he wanted to see, did that have a round plug or a long plug? And he raised the question, but he needed me to say to him, it seems like you'd like to find out. And he said, yes, he would. But then it needed me to say to him, well, you're not pulling the computer out and looking. Whereupon he pulled the computer out and looked. So what did I learn from him? That he's not allowed to touch. He's not allowed to ask. That he has to. Now, part of it was I was a new person, but there are a lot of children who would have immediately asked or said, oh, I want to know, can I look? Or pulled it out, grabbed it, and unplugged it to find out. So we learn exactly what those patterns of relationship
are. Okay, it's
are.
patterns of relationships. Now, in a minute, and we'll come back after the break and get more into the meat of things as I see it. Can you give us the idea of what a 2-year-old, the struggle for a 2-year-old in relationships?
Yes, it's a little harder because 2-year-olds, while they're learning language, their emotional patterns are pre-verbal. They're not in language. So the patterns that we're looking for, that Margaret Mahler and Kernberg and others taught us to look for, are emotional relatedness patterns, just the way that a child emotionally approaches and looks for relationship, and the way in which a child experiences the good side of a relationship and the bad side of a relationship. And we all have those expectations, and the best place to discover where they are is in our significant relationships. And I've often said to people that were learning this, if you want to know what your 2-year-old patterns are, ask anyone you live with, they will tell you. Okay? That is, they will tell you what it is you have to have and how it is you're appeased and how it is you're not appeased. And those are the patterns that come from our earliest love relations, the ones in which we are bonded with our parents.
So in a 2-year-old frame, it's the entrenched patterns we can't break out of that are replayed in relationships later on. That's the developmental level there we're looking at.
Exactly.
Now, when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about what you call the organizing period and get into talking about your books and more of this. So we'll be right back after this break with Dr. Hedges. Stay tuned.
National Guard duty.
Ah, bet he's just sandbagging.
I don't think so.
Sure he is. He left us with all the big fires to put out.
Over 52% of our military is made up of the National Guard and Reserve. They serve in times of war and in times of disaster. And the jobs they perform are hard enough, without you making it harder.
Well, let's hope he's ready for some late nights when he gets back.
Please support your employees in the National Guard and Reserve.
You don't need algebra, geometry, and calculus to get this job. Now, if that doesn't convince you to take math courses, I don't know what will. Call NACME. We'll tell you what you need to do.
Why would anybody give someone they don't know a gift? They do it because this gift saves lives. And the need for it is desperate. We need over 20,000 people to give this precious gift every day. Please give blood. There's a life to be saved right now. Call the American Red Cross at 1-800-GIVE-LIFE.
My world is changing. Within this frame, an ocean swells behind a smile. I know it well.
Welcome back to An Hour, Dr. Stewart. And you know what? We didn't quite finish the 2-year-old, and our station manager, Dave Curtis, has a question about his granddaughter. Dave, why don't you yell out the question here and I'll...
Well, I have a 2-year-old, almost 2-year-old granddaughter, and I only see her once a month. So I'd like to know is what can I make her feel toward me so that she's very comfortable with me and that she would know, you know, that I'm her grandfather. If you only see him once a month, what do you do?
That's a great question, Dave.
So we got a 2-year-old who sees her grandfather once a month.
Well, and we have many other people who will be watching this who have limited amount of time with the children. And I think, Dave, the very best answer that I have is listen to her. And it sounds like a very simple thing to say, but children are not accustomed to being really carefully listened to, paid attention to. And so I think that, like I've watched Sean interacting with some of his children, and while here at the studio he's busy doing one thing and another, he can't possibly listen to them, and they tolerate that. At other times, I know that he sits down and he has exclusive time with each one of them. So the thing that children value the most is simply being listened to. And by listening, I'm meaning find out what the child wants to do. And if she wants to sit on the floor and play Candyland, you sit on the floor and play Candyland. And at first, trying to just stay with a child can be difficult because the things that interest children right away sometimes are boring to us at first. And then, but yet as you watch and you begin to let the child come alive, there's nothing boring about it at all. So I think that the answer to your question, Dave, which I appreciate you bringing up, is no matter what age the child, how important it is for us to try to put everything else aside and focus in on that child and try to hear what that child's life is like, what the child is interested in, how the child experiences you and others and the world and teachers. And it takes a while at first because most of us have left childhood a long way behind. And so we don't necessarily know how to ask about school. And it seems at first a little stilted, like, well, did you have any spelling in your class today? And what kind of teachers do you have?
Dave's done a pretty good job of retaining childhood, I might add.
Oh, Dave has. Okay,
yeah,
well, the people that have retained childhood are better off.
Yeah.
Are better off. Okay. So I think that working on just trying to find each child and where they are, and at first children are really not accustomed to being asked, who are you and what's important to you? And so they won't know quite what to do with it. And it takes a while to develop a relationship with a child that way. And then, suddenly you begin to hear amazing things. Children will tell you incredible things. And your little granddaughter, I think, wants to talk to you. And she would love it.
Grandfathers are powerful.
Grandfathers are very powerful. And they're also special because they're not always telling you what to do. So...
they usually tell you what you can do.
I mean, well, and better off if they don't tell you anything except ask you what you're doing.
Good enough?
Very good.
Okay, that'll be, you got some money on you now?
Yeah, thank you very much.
There's a fee for that.
Now, getting into more, and this is where we can see your beautiful, I'm going to call it a poster, Terrifying Transferences. This is your latest book, and all your books, and I've read them all, of course, have really, in my mind, talked about, as what you've coined the term, the organizing period or organizing transference. Let's talk about the beginning of life and how you understand that and how you've expressed it so well in your books and how it relates to really all of us.
Well, all right, let's continue then on the trail. We were talking about the 4 or 5 year old trail and how the child is interested in family relationships and retains emotional imprints from that period. And then we talked at more or less the 3-year-old period where the child is retaining imprints on how I learn to feel affirmed as a self. And we all need to feel affirmed as a self every day, and so we have certain ways, and some of them are left over from 3-year-old way, and some of them are more mature. So in a consulting room, we're trying to listen to what those patterns are. When we get down to the 2-year-old period, it's sort of mommy and me interactions. And it's not that mommy is the exclusive caretaker during that period, especially not the way we raise children now, but we talk about really bonding. So whatever the emotional invested relationships are at that time period, the child just learns sort of automatic character responses to that, which we carry with us. But what the period that has been the most difficult for us to try to unearth is the period that is pre-bonded. Now, what exactly do we mean by bonded? Or Margaret Mahler's word for it, which she borrowed from biology, was symbiosis. That is, by the 4th month, moving to the 24th month, we have children bonding actively.
So
with
a 4-month-old infant we're talking about
is busy bonding with mother and every other invested person in the household, usually to a lesser extent. And so if the biological mother is available, she's almost invariably the primary bonding person of choice because there's been a long in utero history.
Sure.
But bonding happens with the family dog as well as other siblings and anyone else that's invested in the relationship. So the 4 to 24-year-old period is that period of bonding, and the way that we first learn to bond is the way we look for other emotional bonds later. But prior to that bonding, when the bonding takes hold, there is another period.
And the period is?
I call it the organizing period, and if we wanted to have dates on it, we would say probably the last trimester of pregnancy through the 3rd or 4th month of life. So we've got a 7 or 8 month window, and the numbers are obviously arbitrary.
Sure.
But by the last trimester, we now know that babies are alive to what's going on not only in the womb, but in the world around them. And we're aware as our infant research exposes them to various sounds and to various chemical changes in the mother's blood, we know that babies are exquisitely sensitive.
I remember right before Shauna was born, when my wife was pregnant, I would walk in and I would talk, and Shauna would push her hand out, or Eleanor would touch her stomach and begin playing with the baby in uterally.
Yeah. And parents now are very much aware of this, so they're busy every night reading to the child, talking to the child, and by now, because of amniocentesis, we usually know whether the child is a boy or a girl, and the child already has a name. And so we find parents massaging the child, responding. So a lot of interactions are now going on between parents and babies that are still in the womb. And so the bonding period begins there. But the reason I chose to call this period organizing is because really from conception, the child begins organizing channels to the environment. So we have the fetus at the earliest stages organizing channels in utero to the mother's body. And they're mostly biochemical, electrical channels that sustain the child for the first period in the womb. And we don't have any way of saying exactly when emotional, psychological life begins, but certainly in the last trimester we have reason to believe that psychological life has begun.
Or maybe another word for awareness.
Awareness in various ways has begun. So somehow then the child is now beginning to organize channels not just to the maternal body, but to the maternal mind and to other minds that are present. And children don't think the way we do, they're aware of stimulation, and so they begin responding to it. And so by the time the child is born, the child then begins actively noticing other people and begins to figure out ways of reaching out to mother. By the 4th month, we're quite aware, we can observe that the child is already beginning to interact, beginning to want things, demand things, expect things, smile upon command.
When mother walks in the room, for example.
All of these things are very clear. So as observers, we don't know when to say bonding begins, but it starts early. And by bonding, all we mean is that there's a two-way street of interaction.
Got it.
So that as you and I interact, at all points, I'm sort of paying attention to you. Like if we were playing a ball, I'd throw the ball to you and you'd adjust and I'd adjust and we'd...
I drop it, Sean would pick it up and throw it back.
There we go, okay. So we adapt to one another.
Sure.
And children learn to do that, and we can observe them doing it, presuming that everything is developing normally by the 3rd or 4th month. And yet, how did the baby begin to establish those channels, those emotional channels? So, as we begin to use this central concept of transference, which is that we all transfer from our early childhood emotional patterns from the family, from the self, from the mommy and me, and now,
at this level,
what kind of pattern might be transferred here?
So you're saying what kind of pattern will be transferred from 4 months and under onto the other,
later
or
relationships.
the world.
Later relationships.
Right.
Yeah. So we probably spent 100 years asking that question in lots of ways. And I think we've got a fairly good working answer at this point in time. And I guess there's a lot of ways to talk about it, but the British pediatrician Donald Winnicott has given me the way that sticks in my mind, and it's easiest to say. Winnicott had probably observed more mother-baby dyads than anybody else in the world, because his entire lifetime he interviewed mothers and babies. And then later in his life he became a psychoanalyst. He said that in the early in utero experience, and when the baby also is in mother's arms, that the experience of just going on being, of things just happening because the child needs something. The child is hungry and suddenly the chemicals come from the umbilicus, or a nipple is put in the baby's mouth. And so during this time period, the child's needs are just more or less taken care of. But at some point, the child begins to enliven herself or himself to the world around and begins actually reaching towards those sources of nurturance, of comfort, of tension relief, of evacuation, of all the things that are important to babies. And so in organizing channels that work for that baby, there's a lot of different ways that any baby might do it. The metaphor I've used is imagine a baby born with 1,000 invisible tendrils reaching in all directions, trying to latch on to the mind and body of mother and then others after that. And the question would be, if everything goes well and the baby learns to latch on to get what's needed and move on in life, how many of those tendrils might have to latch on? And for a long time I pulled a number out of the hat. I said, well, maybe 300. If you got 300 little tendrils on mother, you got hold of her, and you can go ahead and develop, because you know how to hold on to mother. The infant researchers Tronick and Cohn have demonstrated just that in their video studies, where they have 2 video cameras like this with a mother and a baby, and then you show them on the screen side by side, the mother's face and the baby's face, so that we can then watch what's going on and have researchers do frequency counts. The frequency counts are of the times that the baby seems to be wanting to make some kind of connection with mother. 30% of the time the connection is made. So actually the parents who are watching can be relieved that 30% connecting with the child is good enough. And when we go to you, Dave, 30% of connecting to your granddaughter is good enough. That's good. And yet there's a great many babies that don't quite get the 30%, and children that don't get the 30% of connecting when they need it, when they want it. So then the question would be, what happens to those other 70%? What happens to all the channels, the tendrils that don't connect in a satisfying way?
So if we use the metaphor of 1,000, 300 channels, tendrils connect, and 700 don't. What happens to those 700 tendrils?
And that's going to be our question, and it's going to lead us to the answer to the transference question, because whatever happens to those 700 tendrils that didn't make it is going to leave an imprint on the body's neurological system, which is the beginning of psyche, the beginning of its mind. And so again, to try to describe or to try to imagine what that must be like for an infant, I have another sort of metaphor, and I do it with my hands. I think there's really maybe, I say 2 ways, there's dozens of ways, but for clarification, I talk about reaching and reaching and reaching, trying to find.
Right.
And if there's nothing there, nobody there, I mean, that tendril just begins to wither.
So we have a 3-month-old reaching and reaching and reaching.
And nobody there.
And it's been assumed the experience is terror if there's nothing there, or certainly if there's something abusive. And of course the tendril will either wither, or if it's abusive, just immediately pull back.
Well, that's the other one. If I'm reaching, and then I get slapped, then I go back. So there's the withered tendril, and there's the constricted, tightly tendril. So the withered tendril, if there's a lot of those, you kind of fall into a slump. We've got kind of chronic fatigue, chronic depression, lack of energy. And if there's the constriction, we've got more the withdrawn in terror and holding on for dear life, holding on for tight. And we've got 700 variations in between.
Right.
So in a way, all of us then have met a variety of disappointing, frustrating, unsatisfying experiences during babyhood, no matter how good the caretaking was. And the imprint then that is going to be left in transference has something to do with what is my reaction to unmet responsiveness. And so when I come to you later in life and want an emotional response to you, what am I already assuming about parts of me that would really like to reach out and relate to you
Sure.
that are not going to be met or that are going to be hurt? And so I kind of have a shell, I kind of have a bit of a wall around me so that in 700 out of 1,000 ways, I don't reach. Because on this tendril that's reaching in this way, when it comes back, what I've learned basically is never reach that way again.
So you internalize a message that says, never go there again.
And we know about those messages. We don't like to think about them. But the way that we know about them is when we're with someone that we love. And we want to be fully present. And the intimacy is increasing. More and more and more, whether it's with a friend, with a lover, with a granddaughter. Okay? And we're busy involved, and the intimacy is increasing, and then at some point, we feel something inside of us begin to backpedal. Like we're pulling back, we're withdrawing. And then if we have enough wits about us to say, wait, what's happening to me? I waited a whole month to see my granddaughter, and I want to be there with her, and more than anything in the world, I want to play with her right now, but something inside of me is pulling me back, something. And as we begin to watch those parts of us that pull back in relationships, we begin to get clues as to the transference that we're carrying from earliest life.
The pattern of relating.
The pattern of relating, or let's say the pattern of pulling back from relating.
Right.
Because you see, the 300 tendrils that made it to the bonding, they're okay. They're going into mommy and me ways of interacting. They're going into ways of being a strong self. They're going into ways of relating positively to people. But the parts of us that didn't quite make it into relationships are always holding us back, and we're always afraid that the other person isn't going to quite be there for us in the way that we need them to be there. And of course, life being what it is, it's very easy to find situations and moments in relationships in which others are not there for us. And so that then reinforces our belief that this is not safe. And safety takes us to the issue of terror.
We have an internalized message that says never go there again, that's played out in a series of replications or things that happen in life that just reinforce for us consciously that message is correct.
Right, exactly. And so by the time older children or adults come to my consulting room, I'm constantly tuned in to the ways in which they sort of start to reach for me and the ways in which they don't. And I use the little boy and the computer. Like, he was very eager to ask me about my computer. So we went out into the secretarial section of the office, and it was after hours. So the secretary had gone, so we looked at the computer. And he wanted to interact with me, and he wanted to interact with the computer, and he wanted to have some life there, and he couldn't.
He wanted intimacy, essentially.
Yeah, and he had to hold back. And so as I listened to him hold back and point that out to him, he'll begin to say, why am I holding back? Why every time when I have a curious question do I not ask it? Why every time when I want love do I find some excuse to turn the other way?
Why every time when I want to be closer or be intimate with somebody do I pull away?
Exactly. And those questions take 1,000 forms in all of our lives. And yet, for some people, these questions are the center of their life. And by that I mean, there are some people who had major, major difficulties early in life. And there's a lot of reasons why babies, either in utero or in the first few months, could have difficulties. One might be, being in an incubator, being adopted, having some kind of a disease, being born with cleft palate, being blind, being allergic to mother's milk, being in Holocaust conditions.
Fetal alcohol syndrome.
Fetal alcohol syndrome, a mother that's crazy, a family that's in some kind of a crisis because somebody just died. So there's all sorts of reasons that could happen to any and all of us that make this organizing period a particularly difficult one. So I want to go from talking about just average expectable things that we all know that limit our loving and our letting ourselves be loved, to situations in which people, because of any one of a variety of life circumstances, pulled in or shut down or withered very early on in major ways. and then have to kind of wing it in forming relationships. And when we begin to get back to those early moments of reliving those in the psychotherapy consulting room with me, what we regularly encounter is terror. It's the terror of being alone in an empty, frightening universe with nobody to connect to me. It's the terror of reaching out to the only person I know and getting slapped or hurt or abused in some way or another. And so what regularly then comes up as we begin to study these deeply inhibited moments in the psychotherapy consulting room is the experience of terror. And it's not just terror in an intellectualized sense, because a body doesn't, a person doesn't intellectualize at 2 months, 4 months. A body lives.
Oh, yes.
So the way it comes out in the consulting room is by shaking, shivering, throwing up, vomiting, convulsing, trembling, hiding, crawling in the room, hiding under blankets. So people, in order to begin expressing trauma that happened in the earliest months of life, regularly have to go to experiencing in themselves moments of very deep terror. And so the title of the book, that is that we all transfer to current relationships to a greater or lesser degree the fear that the other person will not be there or will be there in a hurtful way. But many people do it, experience that in a major way. And they are the aftershocks of childhood trauma.
And it's not just that they're experiencing with you being alone, they're having a reaction to the intimacy in the room.
Yes.
Say more about that.
Well, because in the child's mind, at that early age, if I'm the baby and you're the parent, okay, I am reaching out to you. So if I can't find you, or if you do something that hurts me, in my mind, my connecting with you is paired or associated with the experience of terror or trauma. So in the baby's mind, relationship and intimacy is connected to trauma.
So if I go up and you're the patient, I'm wanting to just give you a hug or be close, thinking, well, this will be nice. No. That's going to be terror, because the internalized message is now being provoked through the temple.
By the intimacy.
Right.
And here again, taking it to a lesser degree, in many of our intimate relationships, we're aware, say, that as we approach our love partner with caring, that our partner may be in one of those moments where she or he is pulling away and is frightened, and we don't know why they're pulling away.
Very well. Give us just a few seconds more about this book.
Well, first of all, I think the cover is very intriguing, and it's a detail from a painting that hangs in my office. The painting is by Nick Cornwell, and actually the curious little detail with the emerged faces suggesting the transference was by his very close friend and living partner, Alan Kirk. And it actually has the sense to me of the very primitive images that our mind generates of terror. And a few years ago, when we had a lot of the recovered memory therapy and psychotherapy, so many of the images that people were bringing up in the consulting room of satanic ritual abuse, of alien abduction, of incest, of molest, of rape, of all kinds of violent kinds of things, the images, not unlike the images on the cover of the book, took that person back not simply to experiences, but to the terror of infancy.
So this represents the terror. Larry, thank you for coming on the show. There's never enough time, and this topic is so broad and so deep. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank the crew for coming tonight. I want to thank Karen Rabicki from Essential Salon for doing hair and makeup, and I want to thank all you out there viewing this show and watching to keep watching and notice our webpage address. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.